We are pleased to be joined by a true Catholic gentleman and a modern man of letters, Joseph Pearce. Stay tuned right after this.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us to another episode of The Catholic Gentleman. We are your hosts, Sam Guzman and John Heinen. If you've been listening to us and you enjoy what we have to say, I'd love it if you just went to Apple Podcast or Spotify and gave us a 4 or 5-star review, even wrote us a review if you're so inclined. It really does help the algorithm, helps us get out to more and further men like you. And finally, if you are really inspired and we have helped you grow in your faith and become a better man and hopefully on your pursuit to holiness, and would you be open to donating, head over to patreon.com/Catholic Gentleman. Check out our tiers there. We've got a bunch of new offerings that we're going to be planning on. Well, we are planning on, and they're coming out later this year, and we'd be so grateful for your support. So as Sam was already suggesting, we are blessed today to have Joseph Pearce on the show with us. If you don't know who he is, I'm going to give you a brief biography right now. So he's a premier literary biographer and author of our time. He has done a lot of reviewing the depths of the Catholic literary tradition. He is the author of acclaimed biographies of G.K. Chesterton, Oscar Wilde, Hilaire Belloc, Tolkien, and books on English poetry and literature. He has hosted 2 13-part television series about Shakespeare on EWTN, and has also presented documentaries on EWTN on Catholicism of the Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. His verse drama, Death Comes from the War Poets, which I hope to talk a little bit more about later in this episode, was performed in off-Broadway to critical acclaim. We could keep on going, Joseph, but we'll stop there. How are you doing?
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so grateful that you could be with us. So, Joseph, a lot of our listeners don't know you. I know that you've been around, you've been on a lot of shows, and you've been in the Catholic circles for many, many, many years, praise God, teaching my wife and some of my brother and sister-in-law, and different things there at Ave. But I'd love to have a start from the beginning. I'd love to hear, you were over in Britain, and you had a youth that was not, Catholic daily mass goer. If you'd love to share a little bit about your history, I'd be grateful to hear it directly from you.
Certainly. Well, this will obviously be the in a nutshell version, but for those that want to know more, I actually wrote a book, and the title will give the clue as to where I've come from to my journey to Christ and his church. I wrote a book called Race with the Devil, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. So I'm obviously a convert to the faith. At the age of 15, I joined a white-supremacist neo-Nazi organization in England called the National Front, and I was involved in that from the age of 15 till I was in my mid-20s. I went to prison twice for publishing material likely to incite racial hatred. I was involved with the anti-Catholic terrorist organizations during the troubles in Northern Ireland, the civil war in Northern Ireland in the late 70s and through to the mid-1980s. 2 of my friends were killed by terrorist activity over there. So, and it was largely due to discovering the writings of this man over my shoulder here, G.K. Chesterton, and then other writers such as Hilaire Belloc and C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, John Henry Newman, eventually Thomas Aquinas, that led me on the journey to conversion. And I was received into the Catholic Church on St. Joseph's Day, 1989, when I was 28 years old. So since then, since 1996, I've been a full-time writer. Although, as you mentioned in your introduction of me, I've also taught at several Catholic universities and colleges, including Ave Maria University, Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in New Hampshire, and Aquinas College in Nashville, Tennessee. So, but my main job is as a writer and I've written about 30 books.
Wow, that's so great. And so we have to, Sam, if you don't mind, we have to probe a little bit. How did you go from, you mentioned being in prison not once, but twice. What was that journey to Christ? What was one of the first moments? It's such, we love conversion stories, and this is conversion story par excellence. So I appreciate it if you'd share a little more.
Well, the first prison sentence was when I was 20 years old. And at that point, I was so radical, so full of hatred, that I considered myself to be a political prisoner and a prisoner of war even. I used my cell as a gym to get myself in shape, using the bunk bed as a bench press and getting underneath it, et cetera, to get myself in shape.
Wow.
So when I came out, I could be an even better political soldier. This was the terminology we used that I had been before. But the second prison sentence was about just under 5 years later. I was 24 when I was convicted the second time. And by this time, I thought, this is crazy. What am I doing here? I don't even believe this stuff. And now I'm facing a 12-month prison sentence for stuff I don't even believe. So basically, the journey towards Christ and the church began in that period between the two prison sentences, and largely through the discovery of the works of G.K. Chesterton. Now, I should say that I would not in a million years have picked up a book that was pro-Catholic. I wasn't interested in Christianity, and I hated the Catholic Church. I was actually a member of an anti-Catholic secret society called the Orange Order, as well as being involved with two anti-Catholic terrorist organizations. So I was very anti-Catholic. But I was interested in politics. Obviously, I was interested in politics. And someone said I should check out Chesterton's political ideas. So this person's suggestion, I bought a book of Chesterton essays for one particular essay in it, which was about 2/3 of the way through. But I thought, well, I'll just pay for this book. And if this chap's that good, then I'll start reading from the beginning. And the rest of it was basically, the rest of the book was a defense of the Catholic Church. So the book was called The Well and the Shallows. The well is the Catholic Church. It has depth, profundity, life-giving water, and everything else is the shallows. Now, I'm not saying that I agreed with everything that Chesterton said, but my experience of first reading Chesterton was identical to C.S. Lewis's first reading of Chesterton. C.S. Lewis, when he first read Chesterton during World War I, when he's in the British Army, he was an atheist. Lewis was an atheist, but he picked up a volume of Chesterton's essays, as I did. And although he, despised Catholicism and Christianity in general, and was an atheist and considered himself to be a cynic, he couldn't help loving Chesterton. He said it was like falling in love. And the point is that the Chesterton's personality shines forth from the page. You feel as if you're with him. And, I loved his sense of humor. I loved his humility. I loved his goodness. I loved the way that he used reason. What was very important for me was, and my generation and sort of secular England, is you had to choose between being rational or being religious. You could be rational, in which case you had to forsake the comforts of religion, or you could be religious, but you had to acknowledge you were not being rational. So Chesterton was the first person to introduce me to fides et ratio, to faith and reason, to the fact that faith and reason is an indissoluble marriage. And that was mind-blowing to me, the very fact that religious ideas were rational. So this began the journey. And then again, through Chesterton, I discovered Lewis and Belloc and others. So by the time I kept going through the motions, it was what I call an arm wrestle going on in my head and heart between these old ideas and these new ideas I'm getting from Chesterton and others. And that was what was going on between the two prison sentences. But by the time the second prison sentence, I was largely going through the motions in my public life, in politics, whereas my private life was reading all this good Catholic stuff, and that's where my sympathy was. So I thought, why on earth am I now lounging in prison for something I don't even believe in? So that was where I was at, and then I started going to mass during that second prison sentence, and I tried to say the Rosary. Had no idea how to say it. I picked up the Rosary, and I didn't know the Hail Mary. I didn't know the Glory Be. I didn't know the Apostles' Creed, and I'd forgotten how to say the Our Father. So, but what I did, I fumbled the beads and mumbled inarticulate prayers, and this was the first time I'd ever prayed. And then answers started flooding in, and what I now recognize as healing began to flood in, and this great desire for Christ, and that was the beginning of the journey during that second prison sentence.
Praise God.
That's incredible. Yeah, you can't be too careful about reading Chesterton if you want to stay a good atheist. Yeah, I had a similar experience when first discovering him. I remember it was at a Barnes and Noble, and I saw this strange little book called Orthodoxy, and I was like, "What is this about? Who's this Chesterton guy? He sounds vaguely familiar." I think I read a couple essays of him in college or something like that, and so but I thought he's a turn of the century, 20th century writer. I've never yet read anything from a early 20th century writer that's remotely interesting. I mean, just dry, boring. Then I started reading Orthodoxy, and it just bowled me over. It just turned my world upside down. I remember just being like electrified after reading this book, and it really changed everything for me. So Chesterton is a dangerous writer in the best sense of the word, and it's amazing to hear about how he really got a hold of
Sam,
it.
I don't know if you know, but the words with which you started that your waxing eloquent on Chesterton echoed almost exactly the words of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis said an atheist, speaking specifically about Chesterton, he said a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. So you're obviously your great minds think alike. You sound exactly like C.S. Lewis, which is good.
Yes. Well, that's a beautiful testimony, and it is amazing how good writing, good thinking, clear thinking can. Excuse me, I'm got a little head cold I'm getting over here, but can really change hearts. It's not superfluous. It's can be quite powerful. So I guess you came into you had this kind of profound conversion of heart, and Christian is one thing, but then Catholic, like what led you to the Catholic Church? I mean, was it Chesterton? Was it his writing, or what led you from that bridge of like, okay, I'm no longer an atheist. I consider myself maybe a Christian of some sort, but then Catholicism, especially considering how anti-Catholic you were previously. How did you get to that point where the church became compelling for you?
That's a great question. I think that first of all, I was always aware, at least in the back of my mind, that if Christianity was real, in other words, if Christ was who he said he was, and then the Catholic Church is the real McCoy, because it's been around since the beginning, and also it's the evident thing that everyone hates. If it's real, that's it. I think that was always in the back of my mind, that the other types of Christianity were like sort of diluted versions of it. But also, of course, my first Christian reading was Chesterton, and then I got to know Belloc, and so I got to understand certainly English history of how the Anglican Church was basically established by Henry VIII. Because he wanted to get his own wicked way, and had nothing to do with being founded by Christ. So immediately I don't want to be an Anglican, which is what sort of nominally I was. I'd been baptized as an Anglican when I was a kid. We never went to church or anything like that. But I think in English culture, British culture, it's like if you're not a barbarian, if you consider yourself to be civilized, you have your children christened. Even if you never go to church, you never pray, it's still something you do, like you get married in a church, even if you don't go to church. So I was baptized, but that was it. But so nominally I was an Anglican, but as soon as I started getting interested in Christianity, I saw through Chesterton's eyes and Belloc's eyes that there was only one living, fighting Christianity, and ultimately there's only one mystical body of Jesus Christ, and only one church militant, and it's the Catholic Church. And also during that second prison sentence, I read a book called, which I recommend, I don't know if it's in print now, Apologetics and Catholic Doctrine by an Archbishop Sheehan, who is I think Australian. But again, brilliant, because the first part is philosophy, the proofs of God's existence, etc., and then the second half is doctrine. So I read that. I thought, this blew me away. This was much, much deeper as an understanding of the cosmos, understanding of the human person, than anything I'd ever come across before. So that's why I started going to mass, started praying, and started wanting to read more and more Catholic books at that point.
That's wonderful. Yeah, it reminds me of the quote. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that the Catholic Church is for great saints or great sinners, but for respectable people, the Anglican Church will do, or something to that effect.
Yeah, that was Oscar Wilde. You're completely correct. And again, brilliant example of Oscar Wilde's wit. Oscar Wilde also said, and something which is very consoling if you're in a prison cell, we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. And that's also very important, because we are. I mean, we are all in the gutter, right? We're all miserable sinners. We're all broken. We all have our issues. But the point is, we're in the gutter, but are we face down or are we face up? Right, and that's the key thing, right? And if you like, conversion is turning upwards, and that was, so it didn't stop me from being a sinner. It helped me become less of one. I mean, I'm not as much of a sinner as I used to be. But the point is, I was looking up and looking at the stars and looking at that through the stars, if you like, to the man who made the stars, the God who made the stars. There's a wonderful poem, by the way, by the Catholic poet Roy Campbell, very interesting fellow, convert, but he wrote a sonnet to the sun, and the first part of it is, "Oh, let your shining orb grow dim, of Christ the mirror and the shield, that I may gaze through you to him, see half the miracle revealed." And it's true, because every sunrise is God's work of art. It's a free art gallery, and every sunrise is unique. It invites us to notice it. And Thomas Aquinas states explicitly in the Summa, basically, that we only come to reality, right? And we only come to reality on our knees. In other words, that the path of true perception comes with virtue, specifically the virtue of humility. And it's humility that gives us a sense of gratitude. And it's gratitude that opens the eyes in wonder. And it's only when the eyes are opened in wonder that we move to contemplation. And it's only when we move to contemplation that we experience dilatatio, dilation, the opening of the mind and soul into the fullness of reality. So if we've never looked, it's a Catholic gentleman, so it's a men's site, right? And it's sort of this macho nonsense. If we've never looked at a sunrise, we're not real men, right? Because we're meant to do what Thomas Aquinas says, and we're meant to see the rising of the sun as a sign of the rising of Christ, the setting of the sun is a sign of death, but also knowing there's a morning, so death and rebirth, and just the presence of such beauty. The existence of one beautiful thing is enough to exorcise the devil.
Wow. Amen. And I'm glad, actually, because that was actually the question I was looking for. Was your conversion sounded very intellectual and poetry, more focused on, I would say, beauty and my humble opinion, but you did such a great job of kind of wedding the two and how you're working. So would you say that your conversion, though, I mean, I will ask the question, not speak for you, but will you say that your conversion was primarily intellectual and then it worked into beauty, or would you say that you were captivated by beauty first? I mean, you obviously came from an intellectual literary tradition even before you were Catholic. So, how did that work for you?
Well, that's a great question. Again, it's going to take, I got to answer it in two parts. First of all, my conversion, and then I want to address the issue of beauty separately.
Okay, great.
But my conversion, I was absolutely convinced it was entirely rational. It was a process of reason. So to use your word, intellectual. Mm-hmm. And it was only later, looking back with the wisdom of hindsight, that I realized the other thing that was happening simultaneously was healing. In other words, that the God's loving grace working on me. But certainly the process was rational. I had intellectual questions that I required intellectual, rational answers to in order to move forward. And so it was very much a rational process. But now to to the question of beauty, I'm going to insist that beauty is part of Vatio. In other words, that we mustn't fall into the romantic, the trap of the romantic movement, and believe that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that beauty is somehow something which is emotional and therefore irrational. First you go back to the Greek philosophers, the good, the true, and the beautiful were, if you like, a prefiguring of the idea of the Trinity. The pagans sort of hadn't got that revelation, but the revelation, if you like, was a fulfillment of this rational approach to God. The good, the true, and the beautiful are inseparable. They're actually one. The good is always true and beautiful. The true is always beautiful and good. The beautiful is always good and true. So therefore, the beauty is part of this rational trinity. And the other thing if beauty is not in the eye of the beholder, it's in the thing beheld. The only question is our ability to see it. Are we blind, or do we have eyes? Are we deaf, or do we have ears? There's an objective characteristic, objective reality to beauty, which and I talk about this a lot. That when Jesus Christ says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," he is saying, "I am the good, the true, and the beautiful," because basically the way is the way of goodness or love. The truth is the way of reason, but the beauty is the life, right? It's when you see the beauty in something that you see the life in it. And in order to see the life in something, you have to have a life in you to see it. So that's again back to Aquinas, that we have to see with eyes wide open in wonder, right? So the inseparability between seeing reality and seeing the beauty in reality. And for someone like Aquinas, of course, the truth, ideas are beautiful as they are. Love in practice, virtue is beautiful. And so not just physical objects, but metaphysical objects, but they're inseparable. So the path of beauty is the path of reason.
Praise God. No, I really appreciate that. And honestly, something that's not brought up frequently enough. In fact, I could see Benedict Rochelle arguing that and really pushing towards that in some things I've read of his, but what a beautiful, thank you, for stating it like that.
One thing I sometimes complain about, particularly in Catholic education, you've got very good Catholic schools.
Yeah.
But the beauty is like you have to have goodness and truth. Yeah, you have to teach fides et ratio, so you have to teach virtue, and you have to teach truth, reason, rational. But beauty is like a trailer, that you hitch on the back if you're not in a hurry, but you leave behind if you are. And to me, that is missing the whole triune splendor, the veritatis splendor, right? The splendor of truth, because splendor is a mark of beauty. Truth is not something dry and arid. Beauty is part of it.
Yeah, I think that's something our culture desperately needs too, and kind of our postmodern rational, I think our culture is kind of burned out on since the Enlightenment has kind of like, okay, we're going to try this rational way of perceiving the world, and we're going to kind of, the world is a big mechanism, a machine. And everything can be explained to these physical laws acting on matter. And that's just kind of the way that we're going to try to explain everything about the human experience. And that experiment failed, which kind of led to postmodernity, which was, trying to grapple with reality in a different way, kind of turning towards the subjective experience of things. But there's an opportunity there where if we lead with beauty, beauty moves the heart, it moves, and eventually it moves the mind as well. But it also, in a sense, it kind of, and I think Pope Benedict, and I do want to talk about your new book here in a minute. But Pope Benedict talks about how, beauty has a capacity to kind of almost bypass the intellect. Like, of course, there's truth contained within beauty, but it kind of bypasses the mind and goes straight to the heart. And you can find yourself moved by a profound experience of beauty, and your mind has to kind of catch up to that. But you're moved by this experience of beauty, and if we look at the church and just kind of this its 2,000-year history. It's like this long outpouring of beauty. And my conversion kind of took place started at least in an art gallery, and just gazing on the beauty of Catholic artwork. It really moved my heart. And I didn't even know what I was drawn to really at the time. Like it took later on, I kind of figured out what was appealing about it. But just this beauty, this Catholic artwork represented was deeply moving to me. And so I think our culture as well, look how captivated our culture is by storytelling, by cinematography, by all of these things that are very beauty oriented. And I think that there is an opportunity there. So I'm wondering, like, you're a writer, and you've written, like you said, 30 books, probably hundreds of essays, in your work. Like, how do you try to weave in beauty into your work and kind of bring that experience to people?
Well, I mean, the key thing is here, that in our you're spot on what you say about the Enlightenment and postmodernity. That the goodness, truth, and beauty are one, as we've said, but somehow they're also distinct, like Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, right? We can't separate them, but somehow or other we're not meant to see just one monolithic thing. We're meant to see a manifestation of a living relational reality. So same thing with goodness, truth, and beauty. So goodness, the way, has been perverted in our modern world, because goodness, as Christians understand it, is a rational choice. Love is rational. Love is to rationally choose to lay down your life for the beloved, even if the beloved is your enemy. So it's a rational choice. For the modern world, love is an emotion, it's a feeling, it's irrational. So nothing you can do about it. Either it hits you or it doesn't hit you. It passes like the breeze, and then you don't love any longer. So we have diametrical, literally antithetical understandings of love. One is sacrificing yourself on the altar of the other, and the other is narcissistic, sacrificing the other on the altar of the self. They're literally diametrically opposed. And then reason. And then when you get relativism, right, instead of saying quid est veritas, we say quid est veritas, right? What is truth? It's something either doesn't exist or it's unknowable. So why waste your time with it? So when you've got a culture which has perverted the meaning of love, that has perverted the meaning of reason, beauty is what remains as a way of getting past those watchful dragons, which is what Pope Benedict was talking about, and also there's a favorite phase of Chesterton and Tolkien and Lewis. You have to get past those watchful dragons. I'm going to give two very quick examples of the power of beauty. Yeah. And telling stories, you could say much more about storytelling, but to convey through a story. Imagine there's a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, an atheist, a Muslim, and they don't go into a bar. It's how you think they should go into a bar. They go into a bar. I mean, they could, but they didn't. They went into a field. And they went into a field in the middle of the night, and they sat down. And they were facing east. And an hour or so later, the sky begins to change color. There's pinks and what have you. And maybe the sun rises, and you can look directly at it. Midsummer, 4 o'clock in the morning, sun rises. It's just a white disc. Remind the Catholic amongst them of the elevation of the host. And then it becomes red. And you can still look directly at it. And when it becomes red and the sky is turning pink and purple, and then it rises and becomes gold, you can't look at it any longer. All of those people, irrespective of where they're coming from with their theological, philosophical beliefs, have been touched by something. And they all feel, unless they're solely broken by pride and cynicism, don't want to look like Gollum, they are moved upwards, all right? They're lifted up. And the definition of prayer is lifting up the mind and the heart to God. That sort of edification is prayer, even if it's inarticulate. And then taking from God's creation now to man's sub-creation, our own works of art. Another story, very briefly. Once upon a time, there was a rock. And this was a very beautiful rock. But no one had ever seen it. It had been hidden for millions of years. And then someone dug up the rock. Now it could be seen. And people looking at the rock, one or two people with eyes say, that's actually quite a beautiful rock. But one person came past who had better eyes than everybody else, and he said, that's not a beautiful rock. That is the beautiful rock. And he took the rock away, and he did things with it. And today, if you go to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and you go through the main entrance of St. Peter's Basilica and turn to the right, the first side chapel, you'll see Michelangelo's Pieta with the Mother of God cradling her dead son in her arms. Every time anybody sees that when they walk in St. Peter's Basilica, if they're not dead, right, their hearts are lifted to God, even if they're an atheist or a Muslim, because everybody understands the relationship between mother and child, and death and life and grieving and suffering and sorrow. So people see that and their hearts and minds are lifted. That's the power of beauty. And as you said, Sam, that might be just the first step, because then you start what it does, it prompts questions. And the questions then require answers. And that's where the kiss of beauty becomes a rational engagement.
Yeah, very much. So we want to go into poetry, but before we get there, what else? I mean, so yes, society has perverted truth, goodness, and beauty, and we're struggling with this. But what else would you say are the primary impediments of individuals such as ourselves, or just anybody within the church, any individuals in their 30s, 40s that are trying to pursue these things, but struggle with it, right? So, I mean, I have your book, Flowers of Heaven. And I greatly enjoyed it, and it actually illuminated a huge part of your anthology there of collected poems. And I remember just going through it, and I'd set aside time every day, but I had never experienced poetry that just kind of opened my eyes and opened my heart. You know, it really brought peace into the chaos of my days were just silenced by that. But then we wake up in the morning and we're not, constantly pursuing that. Our phone is pulling us in one direction, or, I've got multiple monitors for my day job and things like that. So what do you think are some necessary conditions to help somebody delve deeper into, this deeper understanding of life? And I know that's a huge question, but with poetry in mind, as we're shifting towards that, I know that I've talked to many men about reading poetry, and they'll get behind reading like If, from Rudyard Kipling, because there's something very masculine about that. But to actually delve into a lot of the poetry that you present, it's just like frou-frou, or, it's been feminized, or, in their worldview. And anyways, I'd love to move towards poetry, but then talk a little bit about that which is keeping us from really embracing that.
Well, ultimately, the importance of poetry, first of all, it's very similar to what we were saying about beauty. It's the most beautiful language. It's language distilled to its purity. But let me just say one thing, first of all, that we have to understand, if you're going to understand poetry and beauty, we have to understand time. Mm-hmm. Now, the thing about time, we can't make it. The wonderful Jesuit poet Jeremiah Hopkins said in his poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland, "We are soft sift in an hourglass." In other words, each of us has our own individual hourglass with our own individual amount of sand in it. We don't know how much sand it is, but it's sifting away, and there's nothing we can do to stop the sand sifting away. It's all going to happen, and when it all passes through to the other side, we die, right? We are soft sift in an hourglass. So we can't make time. Time is not ours. So when, for instance, we don't own our lives, we owe our lives, because it would be taken away from us. If we owned it, we wouldn't have to give it up.
Yeah,
we possess it. We don't possess it. We own it, and we owe it. So that's the first. So if we can't make time, there are only two things we can do with it. We either take it or we waste it. Now, spending time in either prayer or poetry, and they are connected, is taking time. Spending time with distraction, mindless distraction, which a lot of us spend much too much doing, with distracting ourselves to death in wasted time. That's what we're doing. So one of the beautiful things about poetry is it forces us to slow down. Yeah. And one of the reasons that many men, women as well, I'm sure, but men don't like poetry is they're in a hurry, right? They don't want time taken. Right? So they'd rather waste it doing something which is mindless. So poetry forces you to slow down. That's the first good thing about it. It takes time out of your day to do something which engages with the good, the true, and the beautiful. It's like prayer. And so I would say that ideally every day we should find time, obviously, for prayer. We need to find time for silence. And one of the places and spaces we can spend our silence is in the reading of poetry.
Wow. That's quite a statement. Yeah. I really appreciate that. And how true. Yeah. Because I know I bring up my phone because, right, these things, and Sam and I have talked many times about getting dumb phones and things like that, right? Things to reduce the tentacles of technology that just, wrap around us and try and grip us and keep us from that. But I mean, I can testify to your comment about in reading poetry and embracing it for the first time after I got your book was some 10, 12 years ago. And it was powerful, and I loved it. So I liked your comment, wasting time. That's so true. Let's go for it, sir.
I think if I may just make a pun, because I love words.
Yeah.
About cell phones. I said to someone recently who wanted me to download an app to speak at a conference. I said, listen, I spent 2 periods of my life already in a cell. I'm not going to spend the rest of it in another one.
Yes.
So true.
Well, and I just want to second the kind of advocacy for poetry. I think guys are just scared of, I don't want to be soft or whatever. I just, get over yourself. Like it's just this hyper macho aesthetic that a lot of guys are drawn to is just, it's not real masculinity. I mean, some of the, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the macho is absolutely not masculine. The macho is selfishness. The macho is pride. Pride is the absence of humility, and pride is the enemy. What does pride do, by the way? Come back to what we said. Pride being the absence. The proper definition of pride is the absence of humility, because evil has no existence. It's the absence of the good, right? So pride is the absence of humility. If you don't have humility, you will not have a sense of gratitude. If you don't have a sense of gratitude, your eyes will not be opened in wonder. If your eyes are not open in wonder, you will not be moved to contemplation. You'll be wasting time instead of taking it. And if you're not moved to contemplation, instead of your mind dilating into the fullness of reality, it will shrink and shrivel. And one of the most realistic depictions of the human psyche that's got carried away with its pride is Gollum in The Lord of the Rings. That is exactly what happens to our souls if we refuse to take time on our knees. And if we think that's soft, we need to grow up.
Yeah, exactly. And I can say too, that good poetry can lead to prayer. Like it can move your heart, and before you know it, you are in that humble kind of a wonderstruck atmosphere that is essentially prayer. And I think a lot of guys.
If I can, Sam, I'm sorry, I'm beginning to interrupt, and I apologize, but I'm obviously enthusiastic about this. Great poetry doesn't lead to prayer. Great poetry is prayer.
Yes.
Is what I said earlier about that? Looking at the statue of the Pieta, Michelangelo's Pieta, is prayer, because the lifting up of the mind and heart to God is prayer. It doesn't have to be our spoken words, whether we're doing it from memory or doing it extempore. The important thing is that the taking time in silence in order to lift up our mind and heart is prayer. And poetry, good poetry, is one way of praying.
Yes. And if you've tried reading poetry and that wasn't your experience, you probably weren't reading good poetry. I mean, there is a lot of rubbish out there, but the Catholic tradition, thanks be to God, has some amazing poetry in it. So John mentioned your little anthology of 1,000 years of Catholic poetry. Can you just give us a few names? I mean, Gerard Manley Hopkins and some of these guys are very famous, but I know there's a wealth of others. Can you just share some of maybe your favorite poets?
Yeah, so first of all, that book, Flowers of Heaven, 1,000 Years of Christian Verse, is actually out in a new edition with Tan Books called Poems Every Catholic Should Know. So if people want to get a copy of it, they need to look up that title, not the title of the original edition that you have, because that's out of print.
We'll put that in show notes. Great.
Should know. So it's 1,000 years of Christian verse arranged chronologically. So great poets, or where does one start? You did mention Hopkins. We have to mention Hopkins because he's a marvelous poet. Personal favorite poet of mine, T.S. Eliot, Hilaire Belloc, G.K. Chesterton, Siegfried Sassoon, the war poet, who became a Catholic when he was 71 years old. But his whole of his life was a pilgrimage towards Christ. It just took him a long while to get there. So you know, and I could Francis Thompson. I could have. I don't know where to stop. Really, the so-called romantic poets that that we as men we're not supposed to like. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, John Keats are all marvelous poets. That they really do allow us to open our minds and hearts into the fullness of reality if we read it. Take the time and read on our knees.
Yes. I read quite a few of those in college when I was kind of having my own conversion of beauty, if you will, and I didn't realize that Siegfried Sassoon had become Catholic. That's incredible. I remember just being shocked by his descriptions of World War I. Like, oh my goodness. But that's beautiful.
Yeah, I've heard poetry. Oh, go for it, Sam, please.
I'm sorry, I've been talking a lot, but
no, it's great.
I guess I just want everyone, it's like, you come from this incredible English tradition of letters and you mentioned so many of the names, Chesterton and C.S. Lewis and Belloc and dozens of others of these great Christian writers. And now you're one yourself. And I guess I'm just wondering, what is it special to you about the English tradition of letters?
Well, I've actually got a new book out now called Faith of Our Fathers, a History of True England, which is actually a 2,000-year history of Catholic England from the first century. First Christian missionary came to England around 63 AD.
Wow.
So it's 2,000 years of Christian history there, Catholic history. And even the time of the persecution, to me, that's the passion of England, when England is crucified. We're 150 years where Catholic priests and laity were put to death merely for the practice of their faith. That to me is beautiful. The Passion of Christ is beautiful. It's ugly as well. There's a paradox there. It's also, the crucifixion is the kiss of Christ to the sinner. We do it in return. We do the Judas kiss. Speaking of which, by the way, I'm talking about poetry. One of my favorite lines from poetry, which is, if you're into politics, Oscar Wilde wrote that anarchy is freedom's own Judas. Think about that. What it betrays freedom with a kiss.
Yeah, no, I think, there's so much great things to think about. I know you've got such great one-liners too. We gotta put those in the show notes as well to contemplate on. But you're a teacher, and so praise God for that. So, I know I wanted to talk a little bit about Death Comes from the War Poets. I haven't personally read it or seen it, and I'd love to talk to you what your inspiration was there, because I know those are a couple of your favorite poets, and just let us men know where we can learn more.
Well, I mean, if there are certain men who feel uncomfortable reading poems about hosts of golden daffodils, a good place to start is actually the war poetry of Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, which is gruesome in its realistic depiction of the ugliness of modern warfare, particularly World War I. That's what they were fighting in. And if you want to start somewhere, start with Wilfred Owen's poem Dulce et decorum est.
Great.
Latin, how sweet and fitting is. So Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. How sweet and fitting is to die for your country. That's the Latin phrase that he's commenting upon that poem. But anyway, so I was fascinated by the war poets. I love the war poets. I love their poetry. Wilfred Owen was killed in World War I, and Siegfried Sassoon lived to be a ripe old age into his 80s, died in 1967. But I became aware during the writing of one of my books called Literary Converts of Siegfried Sassoon being a convert to the faith, which made me more interested in him. And I noticed that the whole of his life was sort of a progress towards Christ and towards his church. So when he's received into the church in 1957, when he's about 70 years old, it's a consummation of a lifelong love affair. So my idea for Death Comes for the War Poets, which is a verse tapestry, a verse drama, is that we have Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, these two friends in World War I, but the third character in it is Death, and Death is a female spirit, and it's about two conversions. It's about the conversion of Siegfried Sassoon, but it's also about the conversion of Death, because who or what is Death? Okay, so the first part of the play, when Sassoon and Owen are basically cynical and anti-Christian, Death is like a witch, one of the weird sisters in Macbeth, sort of sexy in a harlotish way. But basically ultimately deadly, and she carries off Wilfred Owen. But then as Siegfried Sassoon grows in reason and faith and embraces Christianity, embraces Catholicism, Death herself is transfigured from this dark, hag-like witch into something almost angelic and almost Marian.
Yeah.
Like the Virgin. Because what is death? Once, death, where is thy sting, right? Once you have an understanding of the resurrection and the life, right? Death is merely a gateway to the presence of God. And so that was the idea of it. And thankfully, that there was a Blackfriars Theatre Company and the Storm Theatre Company got together, and they produced it off Broadway a few years ago. And what I was astonished by here, I thought that that only Catholics would be interested in it.
Yeah,
I was astonished that how many secular New York people think they must be very liberal, most of them, and even the secular theatre reviews gave it good reviews. So to me, this was the power. And there are scenes in it where Siegfried Sassoon is on his knees praying the rosary. Somehow it got past those watchful dragons. So that you get these people that've gone there, they've been touched, right? Their life's been changed because they've seen a positive depiction of a Christian understanding of life and death. And they're quite, everybody has to face death. What is death? It's a primal question. The people there, that wherever they're coming from politically, any other beliefs or lifestyles, right? They were in some sense edified, lifted up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. No, I appreciate that. So I've heard poetry described as a higher moment to meaning ratio in life, and if we view it as prayer and we view it as this transformation, you could almost argue it's the highest moment to meaning ratio, and I just never thought about it like that, so I appreciate that very much.
The most powerful prayers that we say are poems.
Yeah.
So that's the whole point, is that really ultimately to express praise and worship, I don't talk about praise and worship music here, but to express praise and worship, you have to do it with the distilled purity of the language, right? Not with loose or ugly language, but distilled purity. And that's what poetry is. It's the distilled purity of the language. That's why poetry sings.
Yeah, I think it was Cardinal Newman who said that, like, every Christian has the duty to become a poet, in the sense that not that you actually write poetry, but that you see the world as a poet sees it, where everything does speak to you of presences that go beyond what meets the eye. And that's what poets are really trying to capture and convey, is a way of seeing the world. And successful poets can create that same sense of awe and wonder that they were experiencing within you. But again, we return to Chesterton, because I think one of the most beautiful gifts that he gave me was just that sense of wonder, that things aren't supposed to be taken for granted, that everything is a miracle, everything is a gift, And if you can approach life with that sense of I think he said, like, blessed is he who expected nothing, where you shall always be surprised. Like, everything's a continual surprise when you approach life with this sense of just surprise at everything. Everything is amazing. It's like,
yeah,
go ahead.
Well, Chesterton said, one of my favorite Chesterton aphorisms was, "We don't live in the best of all possible worlds. We live in the best of all impossible worlds."
Yes.
And he also said,
far too much.
"Give me miraculous eyes to see my eyes. Those terrible crystals made alive in me, more beautiful than all the things they see, more miraculous than all the things they see."
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to just kind of end by, at least for me, I want to talk about your new book on Pope Benedict, because Pope Benedict is someone who is dear to my heart. He was Pope when I came into the church, and his writings are just so incredible. But you felt moved to write a book about him and about his ministry, and so could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I have a new book out. So I have two new books out. I've mentioned the Faith of Our Fathers, A History of True England. That's Ignatius Press. But Benedict XVI, Defender of the Faith, is recently published by Tan Books, and it's a defense of the life and legacy of Benedict XVI, who I think is a great pope, who at the moment seems to be being somewhat not appreciated as he should be.
Yes.
And actually drawing into the conversation we've had, one of my favorite statements by Pope Benedict, he says that in the end, the only defense for the church are the great saints she's produced and the great works of beauty. So this is a man who understands exactly what we've been talking about in the last hour. And for me, he epitomizes faith and reason. He epitomizes courage. He epitomizes an appreciation of beauty. He loves classical music.
Yeah.
And he loves the beauty of the liturgy. I mean, his book, The Spirit of Liturgy, just shows that the highest prayer and the highest poem is the actual sacred liturgy itself. So he went to great pains to preserve and protect that. And I thank God for him for that. I love the man, and my book really is a tribute to him and an act of love on my part for a great holy shepherd of the church.
Yeah, no, Benedict XVI means the world to me and my family. My wife and I have made the joke many times that he's one of our primary coffee go-tos when we get to heaven. Is like we'll just sit down and have a coffee with Benedict XVI, and I can never get enough of him. And I'm so grateful. What would you say to all those people that are kind of accusing and maybe profaning, who he is as a man, currently and was as a pope?
Well, the people that do not like Pope Benedict are modernists. In other words, they don't actually like what the Catholic Church is. Mm-hmm. So I sometimes say that to those that call him a Rottweiler, Rottweiler's a guard dog. Those who actually are trying to pillage the church don't like the guard dog, but he's not a Rottweiler. He's actually a German Shepherd. And the thing about the German Shepherd, to you who do not like the German Shepherd, wolves in sheep's clothing don't like the shepherd, the German Shepherd. What's the only thing worse than a wolf in sheep's clothing? It's a wolf in shepherd's clothing. Mm. So when we have leaders of the church who oppose this holy man, it's because they're enemies of the church, enemies of Jesus Christ and his mystical body.
Wow. You know how to bring out the zingers. I think that's so great. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Sam, you were going to say, if continuing with the book, what do you hope to accomplish by this book, right? I mean, I think I did read Cardinal Pell's endorsement of your book, and I part of me really agrees with the idea of him becoming a doctor of the church, as others like St. Louis de Montfort and stuff like that, I wish would someday become. But, the church doesn't ask my opinion on anything, praise God. So I'd love to hear you and your intent behind the book.
The important thing is that Pope Benedict now just recently turned 95 years old. He has his eye on the finishing line. The end of the world for each of us is the moment we die. And that could be tomorrow for each of us. So rather than worrying about what the state of the church is going to be like 50 years from now, we should be worrying about what the state of our soul is going to be like tomorrow, if that's when we meet our Maker. So for Pope Benedict now, he's got his eyes on heaven. He's got his eyes on the finish line. That's the only place he needs to have his eyes now. It's the only place we need to have our eyes, for that matter. And that in itself is an example we should be looking to follow.
Yeah, agreed. Very much. So we'll put that in the show notes so that people can get that book from Tan Books. And I guess the last question for us is Joseph Pearce, what else would you tell men today who are addicted to their technology and their cell phones and maybe haven't ever even had the opportunity to experience this? Public school raised as myself was, and it wasn't something that we really went into, never had to memorize, etc. What would you tell men? Where would they start to start appreciating poetry or grab poetry? Or if you don't want to even talk about poetry and you just want to share something that men need to start doing these days, we'd love to hear that.
Well, I think the key thing is, I'm actually going to take the opportunity to advise people to check out my own website, which is jpearce.co, jpearce.co, because that's what I post all the stuff that I'm doing, I'm interested in, which is basically evangelizing the culture through the power of beauty. And you remember the word poetry comes from the Greek word poiesis. The Greek word poiesis means to create. And basically, we are meant to be creative because we are the imago Dei, the image of God. And the imagination is our use of the imago Dei in us to create as God creates. So creativity is important. And the great works of beauty that our culture, our Christian culture for 2,000 years has produced is something we need to know more about. So they can check out my website if they want to go behind the inner sanctum and join the inner sanctum. That I have a Poem of the Week podcast.
Oh, great.
I read poetry every week, and then also three new podcasts, one about poetry, one just revisiting old favorites, literature, and then a third is whatever else I want to talk about. So there's 3 new podcasts and an essay in the inner sanctum, but just in the publicly accessible podcast part of the website, anything I'm writing anywhere, things such as this that I do, when you send me the link, will find its way onto the website. So if people want to check out, what I'm doing to evangelize the culture through the power of beauty, that's one thing they can do with their devices that would not be a waste of time, but taking time.
I love it. I love it. And, men listening to this podcast, if listening to Joseph Pearce and his wonderful accent and reading poetry isn't enough for you, we can't help you. No, I'm joking. Yeah, definitely go check that out. We'll put that in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
So yeah, Joseph, just thank you so very much for your time, what you're doing for the church, what you're doing for the world, and what you're doing for men like us. We just couldn't be more grateful for you taking the time out of your busy life and day to meet with us and have this conversation.
Well, my pleasure, and you keep up the great work you're doing, because this has been a very, very engaging and edifying conversation. And if this is what you do every week, then keep doing it, because you're doing great work. God bless you.
We do. Thank you. Well, as we love to end all of our episodes,
be a man, be a saint.